Hello and welcome to the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Friends. I am your host, Leon Wolf. Today is Thursday, February the 12th of 2015, and we are glad that you have decided to join us. I am joined, as always, by my regular panel of co-hosts, minus one. We're happy to have Neal Doing of the Federalist with us, as always. Jay Caruso, a pocket full of liberty, glad you're joining us, as always. F. Bill McMorris of the Washington Free Beacon, glad that he could be with us today. Filling in for Scott Lincicome, we have Amy Otto of the Federalist joining us. Scott was unable to be here on a last-minute project that he has for his actual paid employment. So glad Amy could join us. And our special guest for this week is Bruce Carroll. You know him and love him as Gay Patriot on Twitter, and we're glad that you were able to be with us this week, Bruce. So let's go ahead and get right to it, the news of the day. We're going to start off talking a little bit about the turmoil that has embroiled the NBC news division, or the news division of NBC. Of course, the most important turmoil that the NBC News affiliate is in right now is that their kind of star property, Brian Williams, the lead anchor for the NBC Nightly News, has been embroiled in a scandal recently over remarks that he made about the level of his involvement with an RPG attack on a helicopter. Williams said on air a number of times, including on shows not including the NBC Nightly News, that he was actually in the helicopter that was hit. It has since come to light through some reporting by military members of the Stars and Stripes magazine that he was not in fact in that helicopter. He was in a helicopter that was 30 minutes behind. Since then, it has come to light that he's had other instances where he has exaggerated his own level of involvement in stories. They range really from kind of petty things to more serious things. And the initial reaction from NBC News was essentially almost nothing. Williams announced that he was essentially voluntarily taking himself off the air for about a week. It was expected that he would go on Letterman about the time that he was scheduled to come back, and that there would be no further fuss or muss about it. In fact, we talked about this to end this very show last week, and the prediction of all the panelists, except I will say me, was that Brian Williams would be back in his anchor chair after this week was over, and that he would still be the lead anchor of NBC Nightly News. However, it has been announced yesterday that NBC has essentially dropped the hammer on Williams. He has announced that he has been suspended for 6 months without pay. And the Daily Beast had an interesting article yesterday that suggested that the length and the severity of the suspension, along with the tone of the letter, the way it was kind of announced very brusquely and abruptly, indicated that as NBC was investigating this, that probably some more damaging information was uncovered. Something to the effect of Williams was specifically told that he should not tell this story on the air as he had been telling it, and he continued to do so, or that there were other fabrications that were involved. And Bruce, our custom on the show is to go to the guest host first, so I'm going to throw the first question over to you. Do you think that there's any merit to that? You think NBC News, in the course of their investigation, uncovered some new information? And if so, what do you think that might have been?
I actually find out now that I agree with you. I think the plan beginning probably the middle of last week was to get rid of him, and they're going to do it by kind of hanging him out to dry for 6 months. Everyone is going to get comfortable with Lester Holt or whoever they put in, and he'll just get ignored by the next news cycle that happens 6 months from now, and they'll find a particular day that everyone's looking over here, and they'll fire Brian Williams over here. I actually think that some of the news I read tonight about him making up that he was at the Berlin Wall when it fell in 1989 is probably worse, and not necessarily because, how do I want to say this? He was literally taking Tom Brokaw's memory and implanting it in his brain and putting that out as his own experience. Well, I clearly remember in college watching Tom Brokaw in front of the wall and was, mesmerized by the coverage and watched it all night. And that's kind of seared in my memory, to use a John Kerry expression. But I would never say, hey, everybody at a cocktail party, remember when Tom Brokaw was in front of the wall? I was there too, you just couldn't see me, and I was behind him. And that sounds like what Brian Williams has done, and I actually think that that's probably the nail in the coffin for him at this point.
Do you think, Bruce, that this is really a ploy to try to get him to resign? I mean, we haven't yet, at least that I've seen, had any kind of statement from the Williams camp, either him or his lawyer. Do you think that they're going to actually fire him, or do you think they're trying to get him to essentially resign in humiliation?
I think it doesn't really matter. I think they've decided that he's out, and they're going to let it. I don't think we're ever going to hear from about this, except Daily Beast articles from time to time saying Brian Williams claimed he was on Newt's moon colony or something. But the fundamentals of the story, I think, are going to just go away. And in 6 months, the best we're going to get is that the official new full-time host of NBC Nightly News is Lester Holt or Katie Couric or whoever they decide on. If Lester Holt is getting good ratings in the next 6 months, I think he stays on. And I honestly don't think we're going to hear from NBC or Brian Williams about this again.
Well, it's an interesting dynamic because, I mean, Brian Williams is getting paid $10 million a year to anchor the NBC Nightly News under his new contract. And it'll be interesting to me whether he goes quietly or whether he essentially forces them out the door, forces them essentially to buy out his contract quietly or makes them fire him. And Amy, I want to throw the next question over to you. And the question that I have very simply is, how does this happen to a guy like Williams? How does he find himself in the middle of this kind of a scandal? I mean, he's rich, he's famous in his own right. The stories that he's told don't make him any more famous and rich. They don't help his job in any way. Why and how does a guy like that become apparently a serial fabulist about his own involvement in stories like this?
Well, I mean, I can speculate. I can't look into Brian Williams' soul, but I think he's made the mistake that we've, sadly, I think kind of what news is versus the people's roles in the news is kind of broken down, and what you've seen here is an example of that. It's a great symbol in the sense that Brian Williams has made the mistake of wanting to become the news. He was not satisfied with being the empty-headed suit who was reading the news. He needs to now be part of the news, and this isn't novel because we see this all the time with the news. The left or, the mainstream media wants to direct the news. They want to frame the narrative. They want to tell us what's important to report. And now they're literally putting themselves in the events that they consider important in their mind, even if they aren't there, that they see their role as so vital in shaping the news now that he's gone through like that fourth wall and he's become the actual news at this point. Where does this come from as far as this thing? I mean, for a man who had no reason to do these things, certainly it seems strange to most of us, but we kind of have this Kardashian-type culture now where everyone wants to be famous. Everybody wants to be bigger than they are, and everybody wants to have some sort of significance, and maybe sitting there reading the news every day or covering it made him feel insignificant. And this is, clearly just some way of combating and compensating that $10 million couldn't do. I got to say, $10 million for me would have kept me pretty truthful. But, for Brian Williams, I guess year after year, it just wasn't enough to not be part of the story.
So Bill, let me throw this next question over to you. If you look at what Brian Williams is alleged to have done, compared to the things that are said and done every day on air by MSNBC personalities, you guys over at the Washington Free Beacon have done a great job. I mean, listen, I don't want to tell you how inappropriately excited I get whenever I see that the Washington Free Beacon has put together another compilation of insane things that some anchor at MSNBC has done. You guys do a fantastic job of that. If you compare what Brian Williams did to what people like Al Sharpton or Chris Hayes get away with every day on air, it seems to be a rather kind of menial sin. And so the question is, why is he getting essentially crucified and forced out of his job? And people like Chris Matthews and Rachel Maddow have apparently total job security right now.
Well, I think it gets to the fact that once everybody knows the big lie is out, once they know you're capable of lying about this little thing, then it's harder to say, I'm completely honest all the time when I'm actually talking about the important matters. So I think that's why this is such a grievous sin. In terms of Brian Williams' future, I actually think Amy touched on something great, which is I don't think Brian Williams is going to go away. We're not going to see him on a newscast anytime soon, but this man is absolutely beloved by Hollywood. I definitely think we're going to end up seeing him on like a Dancing with the Stars type thing, or as Aaron and I were talking about earlier, on like a Celebrity Apprentice type thing. because at least when it's reality television and we're pretending these feelings are real, the audience knows it's a big lie, which seems like that's a better environment for a man who can't help himself when it comes to exaggerating his own greatness. So that's what I think the future for Brian Williams holds.
So Jay, if you look at this, and I read an interesting article about why Brian Williams is essentially being left out to dry while other people get away with far more egregious stuff. You think about a guy like Al Sharpton. Al Sharpton became famous during the course of the Tawana Brawley, the media blow-up that happened. For those who don't remember the Tawana Brawley situation, Tawana Brawley was a young black woman who claimed that she was essentially gang raped in New York City. There were some questions about her story. Al Sharpton was the face of that story down in New York City, which turned out in the final analysis to be an absolute hoax by the admission of everyone involved. I mean, that's the start of that guy's career, and he, has a job at NBC in good standing. And the article I read raised an interesting point. It's the guys like Al Sharpton and Chris Matthews and Rachel Maddow have people who, by their ideological leanings, are predisposed to jump to their defense almost no matter what it is that they do. Brian Williams, as a straight news guy, doesn't have that. If he messes up to one side or the other, he falls off the rail and he has no safety net. And I guess the concern, first of all, do you think that there's anything to that explanation as to why Brian Williams in particular is being singled out for this? And number two, is this leading us to an instance where the so-called straight news guy is a thing of the past and everybody falls on either the Hannity side or the Chris Matthews side of things?
Well, I mean, I kind of agree with a news anchor being held to a little bit of a higher standard than, say, Al Sharpton. I think MSNBC, when they hired him, realized they weren't getting any standards. They were just getting another left-wing loudmouth. Sharpton not only lied about Tawana Brawley, he continues that lie to this day. He still thinks that there was enough evidence to indict somebody. Indict who? How do you indict someone when when it didn't happen? But he still maintains that he told the truth. The man has never once apologized for any of the things that he has said, for the smears that he has leveled against other people. He's scum. He's the the lowest of the low. So in that respect, I think it is a little ridiculous that he's still employed and Brian Williams isn't. Matthews and Rachel Maddow, I mean, I guess they're they're kind of the equivalent of a Hannity in some respect. I mean, there's a lot of crap that Hannity says that's just complete nonsense because it's just basically spouting the party line. I'm probably going to get hate mail for that, but so what? Commentators are gonna say stuff that a lot of times either hits that edge of the truth, or they're going to go past it and they're going to tell something that just isn't true, or there's going to be some serious context that they leave out of it. But that's essentially what they do. I mean, that's how they operate. Brian Williams, on the other hand, is a newsman. He's a journalist, a reporter. He's not a commentator. His job is to report the facts. So when he's telling people, millions of people that still watch NBC Nightly News, it's not 20 million anymore. I think it's maybe like 8 or 9 million. 8 or 9 million people are still watching that show. And so when he's telling everybody he was in a helicopter that was shot with an RPG, people are likely to believe him. So I'm surprised that this actually happened, but I think it's only because all these other lies started to surface that it went there. If it was just the helicopter story, I think maybe the few days vacation would have been enough. But they were launching an investigation. All of a sudden, they cut the investigation short and said, "Okay, a 6-month suspension," because I think that they saw what was coming down the road, that there was just going to be more of this, some more of these little tall tales that he's told over time, which in his case he just doesn't have any excuse to do. He just doesn't have it, especially with the money he's being paid, with the stature that he has, with the clout that he has. You can't be making shit up. It's simple as that.
So Neal, I read an article yesterday that was really interesting to me. It was by Douglas Brinkley, who's essentially become the biographer, if you will, for Walter Cronkite. Now, the Walter Cronkite, by all admission, was a pompous liberal gasbag. Every day he sat in the anchor chair at CBS Evening News. That having been said, the guy, as a World War II reporter, was nothing short of a national treasure. I mean, I still have his World War II videos that he produced where he kind of recounted his experiences and retells the story of World War II. One of the things that Brinkley said was that Cronkite, although he was a guy who was legitimately a guy who repeatedly showed courage in the face of battle, a guy who was literally under enemy fire, was in planes that went down under combat fire, always underplayed his role in events. Always was very careful. Look, I can't remember which beach we flew over. I can't say whether for sure whether I was there. And he did that because he didn't want something like this to come back and, you know, essentially bite him in the ass about his credibility later. The question I have for Brian Williams is he has to know. I mean, we live in a completely different age. I mean, this is not an age anymore where the anchor of the nightly news can say whatever he wants and essentially get away with it without being questioned. Brian Williams has to know that, you know, the military people now have access to their own blogs. The people who were there had to be able to, you know, get their story out, had ways to get their story out that they wouldn't have even in World War II days. Why did Brian Williams think that he was going to be able to get away with this when so many before him understood that they would not, even in a lower information age?
Well, you know, that's the arrogance of the BSer. You know, it's an endangered breed. The guy who can spout BS convincingly and use it to impress other people, you know, that sort of thing. I actually am very fond of people who traffic in BS. I enjoy them immensely. Their company is often far superior to people who only tell the truth. You know, they're just fun to listen to. It makes them more interesting. So the thing about Brian Williams, though, I want to circle back to it, is I actually used to hang out with Brian Williams a little bit back in the day. And he's getting a lot of bad press right now, but he is actually a really generous guy. Like, I've been playing with this sword here. This rapier, Brian Williams gave this to me for nothing. No reason. He said he got it while he was covering the French Revolution. I don't know. Now that everything's come out. But the thing about, you know, Walter Cronkite versus Brian Williams here is, you know, if Cronkite had to deal with Twitter, he probably would have had a lot of the same problems. You know, even though he sort of intentionally, you know, minimized his own role in those things, when he was relating the news, the stories that he was covering, stuff like the Vietnam War. Imagine if we had Twitter during Vietnam. It would not have been much easier for Cronkite either. His credibility would have been assaulted at every turn. Now, I don't have any sympathy for Brian Williams in reality. You know, the guy's dumb. You can only the key to being a successful BSer, and I am trying to be PG here, is that you never go too far. You always have that little grain of plausibility, so you don't lose your audience. So they don't really say, okay, I'm going to go Google that when I get home. Brian Williams just went too far, too many times. That's where he really went wrong. He was just bad at BSing.
All right, well, it'll be interesting to see how this particular situation unwinds. Rumors have it that a major shakeup is under consideration at MSNBC, in particular the entire news division, essentially, except for Rachel Maddow, is rumored to be under the axe. And to me, one of the things that's concerning about this entire situation is that Rachel Maddow is essentially safe because she gets ratings. For MSNBC, she gets good ratings. And I'm concerned... Yeah, that is true. But, you know, we are kind of entering an era where, you know, the news itself is being polarized. Maybe that's a good thing. Maybe it's a good thing that now more days we have people like Hannity and Maddow who wear their partisanships openly on their shoulder as opposed to pretending that they're straight for many years and years, and in fact they actually slant to the left. But let's move on a little bit. I want to talk about the unfolding situation in the Middle East with respect to ISIS. And Obama has submitted to Congress a requested authorization for the use of military force. And I'm going to throw this back over to Bruce for the first question here. And I guess the question that I have for you, Bruce, is what exactly is the game do you think Obama is playing here? I mean, he had to know from the get-go that this is not probably going to pass. I mean, the Democrats immediately came out and indicated that they intended to oppose it. It repeals essentially the 2002 authorization for use of military force that he had been operating under since, you know, he became president and claimed the authority to still operate under. You know, it says no ground troops in Iraq. to me, it actually seems like a deauthorization of the use of military force, and people from both sides of the aisle are attacking him for it. Bruce, what do you think the president is playing at? What do you think he's actually trying to accomplish with this?
I don't know, Leon, because I was confused of why he went to Congress back, a year and a half ago on Syria. He's made it clear throughout his time in the White House that he has a low regard for Congress on matters of all sorts of scope and breadth, including military operations. The entire Libyan debacle was done outside of Congress, and whether or not you agree with his approach, which I know Lindsey Graham and John McCain did, the Libyan thing was done, solely at the discretion of the president. There was never a debate in Congress. Contrast that with the authorizations of war following 9/11 in both Afghanistan and Iraq, where President Bush had a dialogue with Congress, in turn a dialogue with the American people, and that vote was passed. And people like Hillary Clinton can go on for the rest that she had. But it happened. It respected the constitutional role that Congress has. I'm torn here because I don't want Barack Obama's half-assed attempts at making a PR nightmare look any better, which is only what he's doing. He's not suggesting that we use all the might and power of the United States and our allies and NATO to crush ISIS. He's just simply doing a PR stunt and try to get Congress behind him. And I just think if you rip that Band-Aid off and you believe that this is nothing but a stunt, I would not, as a member of Congress, vote for this authorization. It's just, it's a useless measure in my view.
So, Amy, one of the interesting theories that I've heard floated about this particular AUMF is that what Obama is really doing here is he's setting his predecessor, whether that be a Republican or Hillary, he's really, what he's doing here is essentially setting his successor up for failure, or at least setting it up for it to be difficult for his successor to maintain a ground presence anywhere in the Middle East by setting a precedent, essentially, that ground troops can't remain in Iraq or Afghanistan or wherever it is without going back to Congress. He himself has essentially spent the entirety of his term operating under the premise that he had the authorization of the 2002 AUMF to keep ground troops there, and what he's trying to do is now, by passing this and setting this 3-year window, making his successor, whoever it is, come to Congress for authorization to continue a war that he's been involved in from the beginning. What do you think of that theory, or do you think something else is going on?
Well, I mean, I can see he's trying to control the message about it. I don't believe Obama thinks he needs this authorization to act. I suspect that this is purely political, why he's doing it, and it's a bit of running out the clock. He's dragging his feet on wanting to do something substantial in this region, and this is one way to do it, because he knows Congress will drag his feet, and then he can say, he can run the story of, see, we're not there because Congress didn't give me authorization. Although, ironically, this is the same president who we know acts on his own in immigration and in areas where he has no sphere and actually no authority. In this place, he has the authority. He's had precedent. He has the authority to continue to do work there in battle ISIS. He's choosing not to. This is just him making a choice not to and sort of pocket vetoing, and in a sense, just a very passive-aggressive way to defer it to Congress or to try and spread accountability and responsibility for any act he does take to Congress. But I think he's just doing it to run out the clock, because it conflicts with his larger strategy and what he wants to do in the region, which is to cede authority and a sphere of influence to Iran. And I think he thinks that the more he builds that up with Syria and Iran becoming more stable in his point of view, that he thinks ISIS is actually a leverage point to benefit him here. He's using that destabilization of ISIS there to try and get Iran and Syria engaged in fighting ISIS as opposed to us, and he's trying to build them up. So I think he's actually using it to run the clock out a little bit from us acting, even though it's becoming more and more apparent and scary each time as ISIS advance that we may actually have to intervene pretty strongly in the region.
So Bill, what do you think about this? I mean, you think Amy's onto something here? You think that what Obama's really doing is is essentially saying to the country, look, I wanted to go in, really strong and muscular into the Middle East with some troops, but gosh, I went to these Republicans in Congress and they just shot me down. You think that's his plan just from the beginning, is to essentially pass the buck on the Congress, say he wanted to do something, but he couldn't get the authorization he needed?
No, not at all. Just the opposite. He makes very clear, he gives a timetable for withdrawal. He says that ground forces will not be used in Iraq and Syria. That's all in the AUMF that he sent to Congress. So it's not as if he's making himself out to be, this saber rattler. He knows he's not. That's not the image he's trying to project. What I found most hilarious about this AUMF that he sent, AUMF, is the fact that he actually talks about how grave the threat is that ISIS poses to U.S. national security. And if it's such a grave threat, you think you would allow ground forces to be deployed. You think, even through a logistics campaign or intelligence campaign, you think we would want some American ground forces there if it was that grave a threat. And instead, he's just talking about, sustained bombing campaigns, which even his own advisors say is not going to be enough to defeat ISIS. So this is the big thing I'm seeing right here. I think this is him trying to Obama has demonstrated an indifference to foreign policy that I think we take for granted, mostly because the world is on fire everywhere, so we want the president to be involved in foreign policy. But he is pretty much indifferent to this. He doesn't think that this is going to be a part of his legacy. He thinks that every problem that's going on in our foreign policy is George W. Bush's legacy, and he's just the guy who inherited it. So he's working and taking executive action on just about everything but foreign policy. Here is where he wants to get Congress's approval, because he saw what happened when he tried to go it alone in Libya. So I think part of the reason he's going to Congress is so that he can basically fight the narrative that he's some dictator who's using executive orders to achieve his means. I think if we try to fight him on immigration in the future, he's going to say, well, if I'm such an imperial president, why did I come to you when we were talking about ISIS? I think that's actually going to be part of his rhetorical strategy, and I don't think this is about attacking ISIS. I think this is about parrying Republican attacks on the way he deals with Congress later in the administration.
Which is interesting and maybe a valid point, but my rejoinder would be, yeah, right. You think about this. If you read the Constitution, a fair reading of the Constitution would give the clear sense that the president is supposed to have greater latitude of authority in foreign affairs and less latitude of authority in domestic affairs, which are more delegated explicitly to Congress. But Jay, I want to throw this over to you and switch gears just a little bit. Rand Paul made some comments earlier this week that he believes that really who you have to look at to fault for this entire situation is Hillary Clinton. That's where you need to look for the blame. And he specifically says, look, Hillary's war in Libya that he essentially blames her for is essentially the indirect cause of the rise of ISIS. And listen, obviously we've got some 2016 presidential theater in play here. Rand Paul wants to be seen as the guy who's attacking Hillary for a change rather than the other Republicans, because it makes him look like a frontrunner to attack the Democrat as opposed to the other Republicans. Setting all that aside, setting all the 2016 theater aside, is there anything to what Rand Paul says here, that the connection between what happened in Libya has anything to do with the rise of ISIS in Syria and Iraq? Or is this a case of Rand Paul not knowing what he's talking about with respect to foreign policy?
Yeah, and unfortunately for the Rand Paul fans out there, I think this is a case of him not really knowing what he's talking about. ISIS was, ISIS was in the early stages. They just didn't have a name until the last couple of years ago. But this kind of breeding ground in Syria and Iraq has been going on for some time. So this predates Libya. I get the political strategy that Rand Paul's trying to do. He's trying to put the blame on Hillary, who at this point seems to be the presumptive nominee for the Democratic Party. So he's saying, I'm going to put the blame on her because I'm not going to be running against Barack Obama in 2016. But it just doesn't really have much basis in reality, and it's one of those things where I think if he's going to get pressed on it, it's very easy to make a broad statement. But when you're going to start asking about specifics, well, how exactly? Where did it come from? What does Libya have to do with that area of the Middle East, and why isn't it being centered around Libya? It doesn't really make too much sense. I'm no expert on these kinds of matters, but it seems like it's a way of he wants to avoid the talk of any kind of military force over there, because the way he's spoken, he's kind of opposed to these kinds of things. And every military expert has said, it's going to take 75 to 100,000 ground troops if we're really going to go in there and get ISIS out of there. If we're going to really defeat them, not just degrade them, but crush them, it's going to take 100,000 troops to do it. And that's something he's not going to get behind. I don't know if anybody wants to get behind that. But I think so. I think he's walking both sides of that line very carefully, keeping with his notion of kind of not getting into wars or battles or anything like that, just because you feel we need to, but at the same time being politically smart, in my view, in that sense, by keeping the focus on Hillary Clinton rather than the lame duck. And just to say very quickly, I think I agree wholeheartedly with what Amy said about this Obama going to Congress. This is strictly political. He wouldn't care if there was an election on the line. He would have done what he had to do, and he would give a rat's ass about what Congress thought. This is a way for him to push it off on Congress. So if they don't take any action, if they don't authorize it, then he could sit there and say, well, I tried. And if they do authorize it, and there's it's a disaster, then he can just sit there and say, well, Congress, it was drawn up and they did it, and of course he'll be out of office in 2 years, and he won't have to worry about it anymore.
So, but I mean, I understand the politics. I mean, look, Hillary Clinton at the time was essentially Secretary of State. Now, I think that it's entirely fair, Jay, to blame things like the attack on the embassy in Benghazi. I mean, that's under the Secretary of State's purview, the security of ambassadors. That, I think, is a fair attack on Hillary. But what does she have to do as a Secretary of State with setting war policy for the United States?
She doesn't have anything to do with it. I'm saying at some point he may get pressed on it where he'll be tripped up a little bit. I think politically, though, it's good to keep her name in the spotlight and keep blame on her, because at some point here, we're still talking about Barack Obama, but it's still very early in 2015. But by the end of the year, we're going to see, particularly on the Democratic side, who is positioned to be the Democratic nominee. And so far, Rand Paul has largely kept his focus on Hillary Clinton. No matter what the subject has been, he's always out there attacking her for some reason, which to me is a very smart political strategy on his part.
When, that is, he's not, I guess, trolling Jeb Bush on whether he smoked pot or not, or Marco Rubio about whether we should be in Iraq in the first place.
Well, I mean, there's always going to be where things are brought up and he's going to say something. Of course, he's got to, but I think at the same time, a lot of the candidates right now are just doing something that they're positioning themselves for the base, where it's like Rand Paul is more or less kind of sticking to a general election strategy and just continually attacking Hillary. I like it. I like the fact that he goes after her, and the reason, and it's great because the more he does it, the longer she stays in hiding. She hasn't shown her face. When was the last time we saw her?
Yeah. Well, we're going to talk about that a little later on in the broadcast, but I want to turn it over to Neal for a slightly different question. There was an interesting article in the Wall Street Journal earlier this week that one of the things that people don't realize about Syria in particular, if you look at this particular area of the world, I mean, it is called the cradle of civilization for a reason. I mean, the oldest pieces of antiquity that exist on the face of the earth are all in Iraq, Syria, Saudi Arabia, that kind of region of the world. And one of the lamentable side effects of the current war with ISIS is that a lot of these pieces of antiquity are being looted for money, both by the government and by the opposition. And what is essentially happening is people are coming in literally with bulldozers and taking away. And it's not just Muslim civilization. I mean, people may not realize Damascus is in Syria, which is of course a site of extraordinary importance to Christianity. The site of Paul's conversion. Especially Orthodox Christians, still have a seat in Damascus, Syria today. So a lot of these things are being essentially looted and carried away and sold for profit. And it presents a vexing question for us, is we feel that eventually the dust from this particular conflict is going to die down. And I guess my response is, what's the appropriate response for the international community? How do we deal with this? And I think probably we're never going to get most of the people who actually came in and looted this stuff, because they're mostly going to be dead or in prison as a result of this conflict. But the people who bought this stuff, the people who paid money for this stuff, knowing that essentially it was stolen from museums and historical sites and things of that nature, what is if anything, as the international community, can we do from either a legal or a moral or a political standpoint to try to see these things restored to essentially where they belong, which is, really to the history of humanity and not to any particular person for their pleasure collection?
Well, I think it would depend largely on where the buyer of these priceless antiquities was located. If the buyer was North Korea, good luck getting that back. But if the buyer is some Frenchman, then you could presumably impress upon the French government the need to put pressure on him to return those antiquities, up to and including imprisonment of this person. That would be, I think, the only solution there, and it would probably take many years if it ever happened at all. I think more likely what we're going to find is a lot of these things are just out and out destroyed. One of the things that has always just really infuriated me about ISIS and the Taliban, aside from the crucifixions of children and the beheadings and that sort of thing, the sex slavery is another one that's annoying, but aside from those things, what really cheeses me off is the fact that not only do they conquer these territories and suppress other religions, but they destroy pieces of history. In Afghanistan, I remember before we invaded, there was a news story about the Taliban dynamiting these two massive statues of Buddha or some bodhisattvas or something. Just dynamited them. Now these things were a couple
largest in the
years
world.
old. Largest in the world. They were world famous, and they just dynamited them. Now that's destroying history. That's destroying culture. That's destroying religion. It's also destroying a source of tourist dollars for your country. So it's destructive on just every conceivable level. These people are not rational human beings. They want to erase any hint that there was ever anything other than their ideology. That's they're actually quite effective at it, because if they destroy the history and they aren't all killed by us, which they should be, by the way, I think we need to be killing them a lot more severely than we are. Then where they control that, that's going to be the new reality. There's not going to be anything to say, oh, what was this stuff before Islam? There was no before Islam. ISIS's version of Islam, I should say. So that's the main goal, is to just erase any kind of competition, cultural competition. It's disgusting. It's deplorable. We should destroy them. Thank you.
Well, Bill, let me go back to you on this. Look, I don't want to go.
Didn't Neal had his sword in his hand during that whole segment?
Yeah,
I will lead you.
I put it away.
I don't want to go all like Indiana Jones on this, where. What he's constantly saying whenever he recovers some priceless artifact. This belongs in a museum. There's a fine line between the idea that this really is stuff, right? And you have to say, one argument would be, look, it's owned by somebody. So, the government or whoever is in control, whoever we can count as the sovereign in Syria right now, which is very much an open question, has the right to take this stuff and sell it if that's what they want to do. I mean, is that the right perspective to take, or do we as a, I guess, world population say, look, some of this stuff really belongs to history. It doesn't belong to any person, and we need to do what we can to recover it and punish those who are trying to take it into their private collection.
I actually think you have just figured out the speech that will get all of the Democrats to back ground troops. ISIS is crucifying children. Guys, we don't want to get involved in that thing. Guys, ISIS is destroying artwork. MoMA's in danger. Then they'll be like, let's strap up, everybody. Nancy Pelosi is grabbing an M4, tying a bandana around her head. I think that's actually a pretty cool way to get people motivated. As far as selling out the contents of your museum, I just find it rich that we care a lot about the Baghdad Museum, but when Detroit's going bankrupt and is trying to figure out how to pay its bills, conservatives are the first one like, oh my gosh, they have $300 million worth of art. Why don't you just sell that? I mean, it's very funny that we are fine with selling priceless works of art in the United States if it means that we can pay off a guy who retired at 50 years old, but he happens to be a police officer, so we don't want to lose his vote. But if we're talking about, the Iraqi government selling off artwork to the highest bidder to actually put guns in the hands of its military, we're concerned about it. It strikes me as concern trolling.
Well, hold on, no. Though, isn't it a little bit?
Or maybe the U.S. should just maybe we'll do like a whole Iran-Contra thing where we buy out the contents of the Baghdad Museum, and then in exchange, we give them a bunch of ground troops. That could be pretty cool.
Isn't it though?
Yeah.
Listen, Bill. Isn't it a little different? I mean, we're not even talking about pieces of original Salvador Dali's. We're talking about literally the oldest artifacts that exist, showing a record of human life from thousands of years ago. I mean, it's not just art. I mean, it's things like, earrings dating to the 4th millennium BC. I mean, things of that nature.
Thousands of years ago. Do you believe in evolution, Leon? Tell me. You got to answer the tough questions now. You're not fit to host this show.
Right. There you go. I'm only here to talk about trade. I'm going to punt on that question.
Sorry, my champagne kicked in. I got no. I see what you're saying. I get what you're throwing down. Yeah, I accept it.
All right, Bruce, you're the guest. Where do you come down on this? Where do you come down on this issue? Is this something that should these items that are going missing be essentially allowed to be commodified, or is this something that the world population should care about seeing back in the museum for their historical value?
I truly think that any items that we have come upon during our military adventures in Afghanistan and in Iraq should really go to the rightful owner. It seems Mrs. Clinton is missing a lot of her ancient walkers, and she should be able to get those items back so that she can successfully maneuver around the country in the next 2 years. And to have them sitting in an Egyptian tomb in the middle of the desert is just criminal behavior, and one of her law firms should look into that matter.
Wouldn't it be great if she gets inaugurated and everyone's going over what's in her Oval Office, and it's like she's got Kennedy's desk and FDR's wheelchair? Like, that would just be awesome.
All right, so speaking of Hillary, let's move the conversation along and throw this back over to Amy, the most civilized member of this panel by far tonight. So, Amy, New York Times carried a piece this week, which was interesting to me, as we think about the probably imminent Hillary 2016 campaign. What the New York Times set forth is that the network of Clinton loyalists, the people like, Podesta and so on and so forth, is not really playing nicely with the outgoing Obama political team, whose access to the massive money and data machine that they built, Clinton absolutely needs to win. They absolutely have to have that to win and to compete. How much, if at all, are the lingering tensions from 2008, and I think we've already forgotten what a bitter fight that was because it wasn't on our side of the aisle. We didn't see and experience as much of the legitimate hurt feelings that people had on both sides of that clash between Hillary and Obama. How much of that, the lingering feelings of that, are going to hinder the 2016 Hillary effort?
I hope a lot. I mean, I hope that this hinders the effort completely. But, I suspect that they'll find a way to foment, and if Hillary does in fact run, I'm still on the fence whether she'll actually jump in. But I suspect they'll find a way to bridge this gap for the most part. But these are two different animals. These are two completely different political machines within the Democratic Party, and they don't play nice together, and they have a different premise and reason for existing. I mean, Hillary's a much more establishment-oriented, kind of old-school DNC candidate. Obama just trounced her completely in 2008, came out of nowhere, and just rang her bell and ran her off the playing field. I mean, that is going to leave a long-term scar, I'd imagine. And he's been ever since, trying to triangulate, deal with the Clinton faction of the party, do enough to kind of keep them quiet. But they aren't two different people. But I think the bigger problem isn't does she get access to his stuff? Even if she gets access to his stuff, does that replicate what Obama could do with it? I don't know how much is driven by his personality as a fundamental part of it, and I think that's where the friction lies. Is I think Obama himself believes, well, it's not the stuff you need, Hillary, it's me, and you don't have that me-ness, that this won't actually be that helpful. And I think that that's the friction, is that Hillary just thinks she needs the equipment, and that fundamentally is an ego blow to the Obama candidacy and that sphere of influence, because they feel it's very connected to the personality, the imagery, and the essence of Barack Obama, that it's not just a database that did it. It's not just how they ran their grassroots efforts. It's not this list that did it. And they feel like this list is more oriented around Barack Obama than it is around a Democratic presidential candidate. And they actually may be correct in that characterization, and Hillary's team coming to just try and adopt it is saying the opposite, that his candidacy didn't matter, he's not significant, we're just going to take this playbook and we're just going to put in the next Democratic president. For a man with the ego the size of Obama, and I imagine the folks he surrounds himself with that have a similar level of self-perception, that's a message they don't want to hear, and I imagine that's making them want to give up the candy store and creating a bit of that friction. I tend to actually think the Team Obama might be right there. It's not the tools so much. It's a lot about the man at the top that moved that ticket in the first place. And, it was an impressive operation, but can Hillary take that and win? I think they suspect maybe not. So that might be where the point of contention is.
So, Jay, let me throw this next question over to you. And Amy kind of stole my thunder, anticipating my next question. I mean, if you look at Hillary versus Obama in 2008, the base of Hillary Clinton's support, as it was with the base of Bill Clinton's support, essentially was white middle-class voters. We talked about this kind of briefly last week. Those are the voters with which Obama essentially got pasted in 2014, largely cost him the election. On the other hand, Hillary utterly failed in bringing out the lower-income voters and the higher-income voters, the people, I guess, the sandwich, they're the bread of that particular sandwich. And the question that we have to ask ourselves is, look, as much as Hillary tries to pick up guys like Jim Messina and so on and so David Axelrod from Obama's campaign and his email list and his fundraising apparatus, how much of that is it really going to translate to the people that Obama actually motivated to come out not only to vote but also to donate? And will she be able to essentially get any use out of what Obama has built?
Well, sure. She's going to get some use out of it, because you have to remember the data is going to be there, so she's going to be able to reach all these voters. Then you said the next part is, can she actually get them to come out and vote for her? I think there's going to be a lot of this. This is what you're going to hear from the media constantly. First woman president. First woman president. You're going to hear that more then you're going to hear David Brock snorting lines as he is trying to find his way back into Hillary's into her good graces. Look, she's going to be. Here's the thing. It's funny. She is great as long as she is not opening her mouth, and that's going to be her biggest problem. When she speaks, she does not have what Obama had. Obama could sit there and say silly things like, "We are the ones we've been waiting for," and everybody would just go out of their minds. You know, when she speaks and her voice gets into that higher pitch and everything like that, and Amy would agree with me on this, it's like nails on a chalkboard, and I don't think that she's going to be able to be as successful as everybody thinks. I think a lot of people are concerned about the map, but there is an aspect to Hillary Clinton that is even worse than Barack Obama. Barack Obama has this kind of air of superiority where when he's speaking, it's almost like he's saying, if only you guys could think, if you were as smart as I am, you'd understand what I was talking about. Where she almost kind of sneers at people who dare to question anything that she says. And we saw that when she was with the Benghazi hearings, when that was the first time, I think, in her political career where she had been hit with some kind of pressure, where there was some real pressure on her to answer questions and to deal with issues, and she snapped. And so it didn't go very well for her. The problem is, of course, is that we're going to be relying on the media to do this, and they're going to treat her with kid gloves. So here's the thing: the Republicans are going to have to do. I don't give a shit what they say about the whole misogyny thing. They're going to have to go after her hard, and they're just going to have to attack her like they have never attacked anybody before.
All right, so Neal, let me throw this over to you. And Jay kind of touched on the tension that exists between guys like David Brock, who recently resigned from Hillary's PAC, Priorities USA, and Jim Messina, and some of the Obama folks. And one of the things that Politico brought up earlier this week as they discussed Hillary's kind of national campaign, which doesn't officially exist yet, by the way, and some of the panelists have touched on that. She's remarkably late in making actual moves to run that you would expect from a presidential candidate, probably because of her status as a presumptive Democratic nominee without actually doing anything. That being said, her PAC, Priorities USA, set an early fundraising goal that they were going to have raised $500 million by the end of this fundraising quarter, and they have utterly failed at doing that. Now, ultimately, I think you and I know and understand Hillary Clinton is going to raise enough money to run for president, right? I mean, nobody thinks that she's going to run out of money and not be able to run an effective campaign. But do these early fundraising troubles indicate, if anything, a lack of enthusiasm for Hillary that she's going to face going into 2016?
I think it's still too early to really say with any certainty. I do get a sense, though, that there isn't this overwhelming enthusiasm, this anticipation for Hillary among the Democrats. I think that after Obama, they're kind of looking at Hillary and they're kind of saying, yeah, I feel like maybe Hillary would be a step backward. Maybe we should look at Elizabeth Warren or something like that. The hard left of the Democratic Party has, I think, gotten a lot more influential over the past couple years because of Obama's influence. So enthusiasm-wise, I mean, I think it's too early to really judge from this. I think once things get into gear, the money will start flowing as it does. I think that they'll tap the usual sources, and I don't actually think Liz Warren would have the fortitude to go all the way with Hillary, but it may be slightly interesting to see how she does.
So Bruce, let me go back to you for this. One thing that Hillary has done well, we might say, thus far in the 2016 campaign is essentially keep her head down. I mean, several of the panelists have touched on this. We haven't heard from Hillary hardly at all throughout the course of this particular year. I mean, there was an article earlier this week that mentioned the fact that she's tweeted a total of 6 times this entire calendar year, and that's been literally the most anyone has heard from Hillary. She's done no press availability. You can even get, if you're a member of the press, to talk to senior members of her campaign. They will not comment on the record. And there's an argument that that's the smart move for someone who is leading her party's primary, something like 65-10, according to most polls. I guess the question is, how long can she keep this up, where she essentially keeps her head down and says and does nothing, before it actually does open the door for a real challenger, be that Liz Warren or Martin O'Malley or whoever it might be, who can stick their foot in the door and say, look, we have no evidence that Hillary's actually intending to run, that she's doing anything.
I think that if you want Hillary to become president, you should want her to have some sort of challenge in the primary. Now, there are levels of challenges. One level of challenge is you do the Ted Kennedy challenge and try to overthrow the sitting president running for re-election. The other challenge is we Hillary supporters want to make her more competitive in the November cycle, so she needs to be beaten up a little bit in the primary cycle. She got beat out in the 2008 primary cycle, where Bill Clinton really, knocked her clock after the Iowa caucus and some of the other areas. So, if I'm advising Hillary, I would want some sort of token opponent to keep me on my toes during the summertime. But the challenge for Hillary is, with her extensive hearing problems, she may not hear a lot of the questions in the debate, and that gives an opportunity for a no-name candidate from Vermont to jump in and really take the speed away from her. So it cuts both ways. It catch-22. But if I were her advisors, I would want some level of pushback on my candidate before the conventions in 2016.
All right, well, let's move briefly then to the other side of the aisle, the Republican side of the aisle. And I'm going to go to Amy with this first question about the Republicans. Jeb Bush, I guess, was established as the presumptive establishment favorite. And he's had, during the course of his early campaign, a number of frankly, missteps. He hired this guy from hipster.com that he's essentially had to fire. He set up this website that released all of his emails and touted his quote-unquote conservative leader or compassionate leadership, which is kind of a strange move for a guy whose main job in 2016 is to distance himself from his brother, to set up a website that had essentially the exact same name as his trademark phrase during the 2000 campaign. And I guess the question is, how many of these kind of missteps can Jeb Bush afford? I mean, generally speaking, if you look throughout history, the guy who the establishment picks earlier tends to win. But if you look at 2008, for instance, that guy was Rudy Giuliani, and he just made one too many mistakes and fell off the path. How many more of these can Jeb make, or is he already in trouble with some of the mistakes that he's made?
Well, I don't know. I guess I haven't gotten the sense the establishment's bought into him as a candidate, hence the Mitt Romney eruption. So to the point of him being the first frontrunner, I don't know. I mean, if Obama kind of referred to him that way, which I thought was interesting. Which, he's already signaled who we prefer the Republican candidates to be, so that makes me think, please don't let it be him. In that case, so I would think not more. But I mean, I can see Jeb with the. I mean, I don't like Jeb as the candidate. I think there's a lot of baggage there and a lot of trauma. And it's not even the fact that he's a Bush. It's the Common Core. It's a lot of his point of view on some things that have become hot button issues that he probably didn't expect them would be in the past. But in this case, like, maybe he's taking the theory of steer into the skid with the compassionate conservative going, everybody's going to, they're going to pin my brother to me anyway. Why worry about over managing that interface or trying to create a separation when it's literally impossible? So, I mean, I can kind of see that as not a mistake. It's a strategic choice on his part of, I can't disassociate myself from Bush. I think based on that, though, and him making that choice early on, we then, as a larger set, have to say, is that a fundamental mistake that's going to be like Romney carrying the Romney Care thing across his neck and then still trying to win an election? Is that baggage too big? He's decided he can't avoid the baggage, like Mitt Romney decided he couldn't avoid the baggage and tried to own it. I think it's for us now in the primary season to say, we think that baggage is too big. If you're going to steer into it and you don't have a good way to separate it, I think he's right in assuming he can't get that separation. The media wouldn't let him. There's just no way. So I don't think he's making a mistake there. I think some of the hires he's done and some of the blowback about saying he's ahead in the digital curve and he hires this guy, completely some bad choices, those to me are more mistakes because they show a lack of executive ability in hiring and the things you expect executives to be able to do, pick people on your team who aren't problems and aren't going to cause explosions. He's already started doing that. To me, those are more problematic mistakes.
All right, Jay, so let me throw the next question over to you as we're a little bit over time. Thank you guys for sticking with us. Scott Walker, I guess, would be considered at this point the other Republican frontrunner. And one of the things that has interested me about Walker and his approach to governance, especially he's kind of caught the limelight, and he has to know that by now, that he is essentially the it candidate of the moment. He might have been expected to essentially rest on his laurels based upon the record of what he has already done in Wisconsin in terms of fighting the unions and cutting the budget and things of that nature. One of the things, not to toot my own horn, but I wrote a piece on this at Red State earlier this week. One of the things that surprised me is if you look at Walker's budget, he appears to be going for essentially more of the same. And if you look at what he intends to cut in the budget over the next year, He is going after literally every sacred cow that the Democrats have. He has proposed $300 million in cuts to the University of Wisconsin higher education system. He's proposed massive cuts to the Wisconsin public broadcasting, essentially, Mitt Romney's Big Bird problem that he had with respect to the 2012 campaign. He's gone after tenure reform. He's doing all these things in the course of the budget. Do you think that this militant, tone that he's setting with respect to his budget proposal, do you think that it's a good idea for him to continue to do, or should he be throttling it back? Both in terms of how he's going to approach the primary and, supposing he wins, how it will affect him in the general election.
Well, the thing that's going to, in the primary, it's certainly going to help. I mean, if he was to dial it back and suddenly started to spend more money or, restoring cuts that he had previously made, that's not going to look good. His opponents are going to jump all over that. And this gives him, the credibility going into the primaries, which is where I still think that the guys who are doing the guys who are the executives have a stronger hand to play than the senators, because they have a record where they're going to sit there and say, look what I did. When Rick Perry, who's kind of been quiet lately because of this indictment that's hanging over him, if this thing goes away, he's going to come back, and the jobs record in Texas is absolutely stunning. So that's going to be something he's going to point to. But Scott Walker is going to sit there and say, yeah, I beat the unions, I expanded school choice statewide, we've cut the budget, I've lowered taxes, all the things that Republican primary voters want to hear. He's pro-life. And I think, and we had discussions about this, and Aaron, who's not here, but he's there in the background, is going to hear this, is that, he was wondering, is he going to be able to do this nationwide? And Walker has this way about him, kind of easygoing, it's that Midwestern kind of easygoing kind of guy that I think makes people feel comfortable. And that's what you're going to have. I mean, that's such a key thing. Again, you go back to the 2012 election, and you look at issue after issue, taxes, the deficit, foreign policy. It was like Mitt Romney was, even or a little bit ahead, only slightly behind in certain areas. But when it came to the question of cares about people like you, that is where Romney got killed. I think 88% or something said, Obama, and 12% said Romney. It was awful. And Walker has that pedigree that he can identify with, middle class people. His father was a pastor. I think his mom was an accountant. I mean, they weren't wealthy. The college. It's funny, the college degree thing has started to come up. That's going to be funny. That ridiculous 2,300 word expose by the Washington Post was a big nothing burger. So I think that's going to help him, and I think it really does help him when he gets, let's say he's a candidate against Hillary in the general. It's going to help him very well, because she's going to be looked at as kind of like the Washington insider elitist, and Walker is going to be able to play, I'm the outsider guy with a conservative record in a blue state, and I can do the rest for the country. Do the same for the country.
So, Bill, we're going to throw the last kind of serious question of the night over to you, because you're a labor reporter guy. This is kind of your bailiwick as a writer. And one of the things that's been interesting to me is that Bruce Rauner over in Illinois kind of ran on the platform, essentially, that he was going to be a guy who was like Scott Walker, a guy who's like Chris Christie, who was going to go after the public sector unions. I myself had my skepticism that he was going to actually make steps toward that. It seems, for all intents and purposes, that Rauner was very serious about his promise, and he is making some efforts to really go after a lot of the public sector unions and sacred cows there in Illinois. We have seen that Walker and Christie were both able to do this successfully, get reelected, and to actually make real reforms to their budget. That having been said, Illinois is not Wisconsin or even New Jersey. Even though those are two blue states, Illinois is a whole different animal. How do you rate Rauner's probability of success, either in terms of implementing the reform, number one, or number two, getting reelected if he does end up succeeding the day?
Well, here's the surprising thing about Rauner. His situation is more akin to that of Rick Snyder up in Michigan, except Rauner is at an even bigger disadvantage in that Democrats control both houses of the legislature. But if you look at what Rauner did, Rauner is not trying to push a reform through the Democratic House and the Democratic Senate. He is actually doing the Barack Obama way of conducting business and using an executive order to achieve the end of allowing people, public employees, for the first time in their lives in Illinois, to get themselves out of a forced union dues situation. It's actually a groundbreaking path. It's similar and akin to the achievement that Scott Walker had, with two big caveats. Number one, 87% of all lawmakers at the state level in Illinois receive money from public sector unions. Public sector unions are the biggest campaign contributors at the statewide level. So he is actually battling something that is far more influential than the forces that Snyder had to battle in Michigan. The second big part is that he is actually taking his executive order, unlike Obama, and immediately subjecting it to judicial review. He is taking his executive order and has actually said, we're going to go straight to the federal court system to make sure that this executive order is legal. And that's the big surprising move. And it's actually politically brilliant. And here's why. Last year, the Supreme Court in Harris v. Quinn ruled 5-4 that the state of Illinois could not compel home health care workers to automatically pay union dues to SEIU. Now, this only applied to the home health care workers. It only applied to Illinois. But the principle, the legal principle that had sustained this system, was viewed as constitutionally suspect by Justice Alito in the majority opinion. And that's actually emboldened a California public school teacher to challenge the entire system of coercive unionism in schools, in state offices, in local government offices. This is actually, it's my blue collar. Sorry, everybody, all the listeners. We have a chat system, and they're making fun of my collar right now. I'm making up for the bow tie last week. But anyway, the Supreme Court is actually going to hear a case this year challenging the very concept of coercive dues in the public sector. And they could end up ruling in June about this. So if anything, Ronder's move is politically, because he is going to be 4 months ahead of this court order, and it's actually going to be a big victory for him, and that he can say the Democrats were bought off by the union to do something that was unconstitutional. The Supreme Court itself said that this was bad. So it's actually a very exciting development. And I'm sorry that I managed to go through an entire segment without making a terrible crass joke.
Yes. We appreciate, Bill, your efforts to not single-handedly downgrade our rating on the iTunes podcast that we have. We want to encourage everybody to go to iTunes and subscribe to our podcast. All right, so let's close off the show here. We've gone over time. We do have to have our lightning round. Let's have a real quick round of questions. I'm going to go to Neal first. Jon Stewart, of course, has announced his resignation, his imminent resignation from The Daily Show. Somebody had a great tweet on Twitter the other day. I can't remember who it was. It said basically, the left loves Jon Stewart more than I love my own family. I enjoyed The Daily Show from time to time as much as the next guy, but man, folks on the left have really just flipped their lid about the fact that Jon Stewart is leaving. Myself, I preferred Craig Kilborn in the role. I'm old enough to remember that. But I guess the question that I'm going to ask the guys in the lightning round, where do you see, what's Jon Stewart's next move? I mean, surely he's not just going to fade into obscurity and do nothing. Where do you see Jon Stewart landing next now that he's leaving The Daily Show?
I think he'll take some time off and probably pursue a few passion projects. If you remember, he took an extended hiatus last year, the year before, grew a beard, all that stuff, and went and did some kind of movie or something that nobody can remember. But he'll do stuff like that, and while he is in talks for his next gig, and after he gets bored being unknown for what he really loves, he'll go back to the well and end up probably doing something similar, or doing some kind of just guest spots on a few things, ease back into the public consciousness. That's my guess.
Bruce, where do you see Jon Stewart going next after leaving The Daily Show?
It's not well known, but the rumor is that Jon Stewart is going to do a one-man play on Broadway where he will be transitioning Lindsey Graham from a man to a woman. There is details to follow about that, but you heard it first. The John Gramsci on stage going from male to woman. It's going to be the big Tony winner from next year.
This will be a bigger splash than Joaquin Phoenix's rap career that he had for 3 years.
Yes.
All right. Amy, where do you think Jon Stewart's going to go next now that he's left The Daily Show?
You know, I don't know, but it is really fun to watch the left lose their security blankie. They're completely losing it. But how about we do the opposite? We say Brian Williams gets to take over The Daily Show, since he doesn't really report the actual news.
There you go. Good suggestion. All right, Jay, where do you think I said Brian Williams. Where do you think Jon Stewart ends up now that he's left The Daily Show?
Well, first I have to say, politics aside, one of the most brilliant bits that Jon Stewart did was when he went off on Chicago-style pizza, defending New York-style pizza. It was absolutely brilliant because
it's not a pizza, it's a casserole.
It's a casserole. He said, when I get drunk and fall asleep on my pizza, I don't want to drown in my pizza. There was even a Star Wars reference in there. I think he's actually going to go and continue to direct. Actually, the movie that he did called Rosewater was really good. And I didn't even know when I had seen it. Somebody had suggested to me, said, "See this movie? It's pretty good." And I saw the director. His name is Jon Stewart. I was like, "Oh, I wonder if he's." I said Jon Stewart, and then somebody told me that was the Jon Stewart, and I was like, "Wow, this is really surprising." Because Stewart's really not that funny. He just has he has really great writers. If you saw that ridiculous Washington, D.C. thing with him and Colbert, the two of them tried to be funny, and it was pathetic because they didn't have 14 people writing the script for them. So I think he's going to do something. He's going to be behind the scenes. So behind a camera, directing another movie, that's going to be his next gig.
What do you think, Bill? Where does Jon Stewart go from here?
I think he takes on. I think he does what Neal says, and he does a bunch of James Franco-esque cerebral passion projects that are universally panned by critics. And then eventually he spends all his money and he becomes Ed McMahon to Stephen Colbert's Carson.
Nice.
Heyo.
That would
I just want to
be
make
great.
Bruce
As
laugh.
long as he doesn't become Randy Quaid.
Right. We
No, that would
hope
be
to avoid
better.
that terrible fate.
That would be better.
Just you guys wait. Randy Quaid's right about everything.
Well, from my own personal viewpoint, at least my hope, I don't know that this is a prediction, my hope is actually that he goes back to doing just straight stand-up work. I'll disagree slightly from Jay. Having seen his old stand-up work that he did, a live special from HBO, or from Miami on HBO that he did, was I think, a fantastic stand-up routine, one of probably the 10 best that I've ever seen, and I'm kind of a heavy consumer of stand-up comedy. So I hope that that's what he kind of gets back to.
Probably like
doing any television. Yeah. So in any event, we're going to close off the show. We've gone way over time. Thank you guys for sticking with us. I want to thank my panelists for coming and taking time out of their night to be with us tonight. Thank you, Neal Doing of the Federalist. Appreciate your comments, your presence as always. Jay Caruso, A Pocket Full of Liberty. F. Bill McMorris of the Washington Free Beacon. Amy Otto of the Federalist. Thank you for filling in for Scott Lincicome, who had to abandon us at the last minute. Thank you, Bruce Carroll, Gay Patriot. Find him on Twitter, @GayPatriot. Thank you very much for taking time on a business trip, no less, traveling to be with us here on the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Friends. Thank you all for watching. We'll see you next week.
Oh, duels.
Hey, I want to be the one to say something stupid right before we go off.
No, that's always my job. That's bullshit.
Oh.